Haven Arrest Missionary Baptist Church, Union Gospel Presses, Sunday School Lesson number 5, Sunday, June 30th, 2019. The lesson is entitled, Abram's First Son. Lesson text comes from Genesis chapter 16, verses 1 through 11, and 15 through 16. Related scriptures are 1 Samuel 1, 1 through 6, Genesis 30, 1 through 5, Psalms 116, 1 through 9, and Genesis 25, 12 to 18. The place is Canaan. The time is 2079 BC. Have you ever believed that God made you a promise only to be discouraged by a long period of waiting? This happens to most, if not all, Christians. It also happened to many Bible characters, including Abram, a man of great faith. Many times we deal with prolonged anticipation as we wait for God to answer our prayers. Sometimes we may even question whether he hears us or not. Even Jesus' own disciples, frantic in a storm-tossed boat, asked him if he cared that they were about to die. Mark 4:38. Rest assured that God does hear you and care for you. If you are still waiting, keep trusting. You have his word that he is going to come through for you. Today's aim, facts. To realize that sometimes God requires us to wait to receive the blessings he has promised. Principle, to learn that it is never wise to allow a period of waiting to result in unbelief. Application, to learn that acting on doubt and unbelief will never bring about God's blessing. Illustrating the lesson, we sometimes get confused and discouraged while waiting for God to do what he has promised. We cannot waver and live in unbelief. However, because it leads to disastrous results. Practical points. 1. Believing God means we trust him even during times of waiting. Genesis 16, 1, 2. 2. God is not bound by society's customs and traditions in carrying out his plan. Verses 3 through 4. 3. Pursuing our own plans apart from God's direction can come back to haunt us. Verses 5 through 6. 4. We can trust God who always sees us and always cares for us, even in our darkest moments and trials. Verses 7 through 8. 5. When believers are in trouble, we can still trust God to work our issues out as we submit to him. Verses 9 through 11. 6. Man's mistakes will never derail God's plan. Verses 15 through 16. Golden text. Hagar bare Abram a son, and Abram called his son's name, which Hagar bare, Ishmael. Genesis 15 through 16. Today we have 2 lesson outlines. The first is family conflict, coming from Genesis 16, 1 through 6. The second is divine intervention, coming from Genesis 16, 7 through 11, and 15 through 16. Introduction. We live in a world filled with conflicts of many types. Nations are in conflict with each other. Political opponents are escalating conflict in extreme ways. A growing animosity between unlawful people and law enforcement causes tension in many cities. Even supposedly friendly competitions between schools in basketball, baseball, volleyball, wrestling, and other sports, all are which are meant to develop both athletic and interpersonal skills, can get out of hand and turn into bitter rivalries and open conflict. Among the most damaging of conflicts are those that occur in family relationships. We sometimes hear of parents and children at odds with each other, siblings squabbling, especially during times when an inheritance is being divided, and husband and wives fighting over almost anything. Such situations stand in sad contrast to what family should be like, with members truly loving one another, enjoying gatherings when all are together, and having times of laughter and singing. Family conflict. Genesis 16:1. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, bare him no children, and she had a handmaid, an Egyptian, whose name was Hagar. Verse 2. And Sarai said unto Abram, Behold now, the Lord hath restrained me from bearing. I pray thee, go in unto my maid. It may be that I may obtain children by her. And Abram hearkened to the voice of Sarai. Verse 3. And Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar, her maid, the Egyptian, after Abram had dwelt 10 years in the land of Canaan, and gave her to her husband Abram to be his wife. Verse 14. And he went in unto Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, her mistress was despised in her eyes. Verse 5. And Sarai said unto Abram, My wrong be upon thee. I have given my maid unto thy bosom, and when she saw that she had conceived, I was despised in her eyes. The Lord judge between me and thee. Verse 6. And Abram said unto Sarai, Behold, thy maid is in thy hand. Do to her as it pleases thee. And when Sarai dealt hardly with her, she fled from her face. Sarai's suggestion, Genesis 16:1 through 2. Most of us have had times when God did not seem to be working on our behalf. At least he was not doing for us what we had hoped and prayed for. That is when we find ourselves being tempted to do things on our own way and not wait upon God any longer. Most of us have always also learned that such a pathway will more often than not lead to disaster instead of the results we desired. Sometimes we can backtrack and get things right again, but at other times that is not possible. Abram had been waiting for the son God had promised him. He was now almost 86 years old. It was more than 10 years since his departure from Haran and God's covenant promise to give him a multitude of descendants. 12:1-3. It is not surprising that both he and Sarai became impatient with the long delay. In the culture of the day, the blame for childlessness fell upon the wife much more than upon the husband. Sarai suggested a solution that was common in their culture. Since she had not produced children for Abram, she was considered a failure, especially since she had not had a son who could be his heir. In their culture, it was legal and acceptable for her to give Abram her maidservant, by whom he could hopefully produce a male heir. From Sarah's perspective, this was a far better solution than letting him have a second wife from outside the household, because she could still maintain control in the home even while the child belonged to the maid. An outside wife would have many of the rights of the primary one. This was surely a difficult and stressful situation for both Abram and Sarai. Abram's response, Genesis 16:3-4. From the viewpoint of our present world, and especially from the perspective of believers, it is difficult to understand why Abram would be open to Sarai's suggestion. We can explain it only on the basis of its cultural acceptability. This in no way condones it, but it does help us understand how he could have been pulled into the idea. It might be that his compassion for Sarai, who would have been bearing the brunt of the shame, compelled him to provide her some relief. The situation reminds us of Adam listening to Eve. We know that the end result of that was passing the blame onto someone else, and we will soon see the same thing happen here. Abram listened to Sarai. The maid was an Egyptian, perhaps having become part of the household during Abram's time in Egypt, 12:14-20. In chapter 16, the wording of verse 3 gives the impression that Sarai formally presented Hagar to Abram for the specific purpose of producing a child that Sarai could in turn present to him. After Sarai gave Hagar to Abram to be a second wife, he was intimate with her, and it resulted in pregnancy. This had been the desired aim all along and should have been cause for joy, but instead it quickly became the cause of jealousy and anger. Hagar, realizing that she had become pregnant while Sarah could not, began to look down on her mistress. She no longer showed the respect that she had previously given. The tension began immediately. Proverbs 30 includes an interesting insight into the situation. For 3 things the earth is disquieted, and for 4 which it cannot bear. For a servant when he reigneth, and a fool when he is filled with meat. For an odious woman when she is married, and an handmaid that is heir to her mistress. Verses 22 to 23, 21 through 23. When Abram followed culture instead of God, he created long-term trouble. Sarai's displeasure, Genesis 16, 5 through 6. No doubt for Hagar, this was a door of opportunity. To become the first concubine of the great Abram was a considerable step up from being the slave of Sarai. All of Abram's camp knew his wife was barren, and word of Hagar's fertility probably traveled fast. But Sarai was not quite ready to be replaced as the mistress of the house. Her immediate reaction was to place the blame on Abram for going along with her idea. Abram and Sarai were quickly learning that accomplishing things outside of God's ways has repercussions. They had acted according to human assumptions instead of according to God's ways. And now Sarai, who had conjured up the idea in the first place, was the first to feel the consequences. Her harsh words blamed Abram. My wrong be upon thee. I have given my maid unto thy bosom, and when she saw that she had conceived, I was despised in her eyes. The Lord judge between me and thee. Verse 5. And all Abram could do was meekly let Sarai take whatever action she wanted. Hagar was Sarai's property, so she was caught in the middle of a conflict over which he had little control. Sarai therefore treated Hagar harshly, so harshly that the maid packed up and fled from the home. Neither Abram nor Sarai were honorable in this situation. Both of them acted badly. Following our own ways rather than God's leads to tension and frustration, which often lead to further actions that are not pleasing to Him. Divine intervention. Verse 7. And the angel of the Lord found her by a fountain of water in the wilderness, by the fountain in the way to Shur. Verse 8. And he said, Hagar, Sarai's maid, whence camest thou, and whither wilt thou go? And she said, I flee from the face of my mistress Sarai. Verse 9. And the angel of the Lord said unto her, Return to thy mistress, and submit thyself under her hands. Verse 10. And the angel of the Lord said unto her, I will multiply thy seed exceedingly, that it shall not be numbered for multitude. Verse 11. And the angel of the Lord said unto her, Behold, thou art with child, and shalt bear a son, and shalt call his name Ishmael, because the Lord hath heard thy affliction. Verse 15. And Hagar bare Abram a son, and Abram called his son's name, which Hagar bare, Ishmael. Verse 16. And Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bare Ishmael to Abram. The angel's question, Genesis 16, 7 through 8. Apparently, Hagar was planning to go back to Egypt because the way to Shur was in the northwestern part of the desert of Arabia. She was found there near a fountain of water by the angel of the Lord. Here was a distressed, anguished woman fleeing from the most difficult time of her life so far, and God sought her out in order to communicate with her. This is the first mention in the Old Testament of the angel of the Lord, verse 7. But the title will appear many more times. It often refers to the pre-incarnate appearance of Jesus, which is referred to as a Christophany. That this identify is correct here means to be confirmed in verse 13, where Hagar acknowledged having seen God. This incident reminds us of the time Joshua saw a man with a drawn sword who identified himself as the commander of the Lord's army who had accepted Joshua's worship. Joshua 5:13 through 15. The angel asked Hagar two questions. Where did you come from and where are you going? Genesis 16:8. Notice that he addressed her as Hagar, Sarai's maid, which is a less than subtle hint that he did not approve of her relationship with Abram. He knew, of course, where she had come from and where she was going, but he wanted her to face the facts of her situation. God does this with us sometimes, knowing that if we need to make a change of direction in our lives, we must first acknowledge where we are. Hagar freely admitted that she was fleeing from Sarai. This was the first step in receiving the accepting direction from the angel. Honestly, before God is a prerequisite for further instruction from him. The angel's instruction, Genesis 16:9 through 10. The angel of the Lord responded with a command and a promise. The command was for Hagar to return to Sarai and submit to her. That was surely difficult for Hagar to hear, and probably the last thing she wanted to do at that moment. This is a subtle reminder of the biblical principle of submission to those in authority over us, a principle that is taught and illustrated many times throughout the rest of the Bible, and one we should be careful to adhere to. The Hebrew word for submit in verse 9 means to humble oneself, which is a good way to understand what submitting is. It is a natural propensity for us to want to be free to do what we want, when we want, and not to have to give in to the wishes of someone else. Nevertheless, God has established authority in every area of life. So we need to recognize when we are to lay aside our desires in favor of someone else's. This is God's way. The best example of this is Jesus' willingness to submit to his Father's will. This difficult command for Hagar was tempered by the angel's promise. I will multiply thy seed exceedingly, that it shall not be numbered for multitude. Verse 10. For Hagar to do what the angel said on the basis of this promise certainly required faith on her part. He was telling her not only that she would have descendants, but also that they were going to be many in number. All this from one child fathered by a man, not really her husband. Hagar had lived in a home where God was known and his ways taught. What she had heard and learned prepared her for this encounter. Because of this, she was able to obey the Lord's words. The angel's explanation, Genesis 16:11. The angel first reiterated what Hagar already knew, that she was with child. He then added that her baby was going to be a boy, whom she was to name Ishmael. The name means God hears, and the angel explained its significance in her case. The Lord have heard thy affliction. In the Old Testament, the concept that God hears usually includes the idea that he is prepared to act on behalf of the person he is listening to. This is vividly illustrated when God appeared to Moses, commissioning him to return to Egypt and lead his people away from there. And the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people which are in Egypt, and have heard their cry by reason of their taskmasters. For I know their sorrows, and I am come down to deliver them out of the hands of the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of that land unto a good land and a large, unto a land flowing with milk and honey. Exodus 3:7-8. Our present passage narrates an incident in which God took notice of a lowly servant girl and spoke to her to encourage her and meet her needs. We should not take this lightly because it serves as a reminder that the Lord notices every one of us and will be there for us when we need him the most. Ishmael would not be the heir of the covenant, but he was significant enough in God's eyes that he would become the father of a huge number of people. Hagar's plight was noticed by God, and she was comforted directly by him. Hagar's response reveals her faith. She acknowledged that God had seen her and she had seen him, Genesis 16:13. The well where he found her would also be a continual reminder to her of the incident, for it was named Bai Eloha Eloi, verse 14, which means the well of the living one who sees me. This is a reminder to us as well that there is no running from God to a place where he cannot find us. Ironically, Isaac, the heir to the covenant, would later live by that well. 25:11. Ishmael's birth, Genesis 16:15-16. Abram must have rejoiced over Hagar's return, for she was carrying his son. She apparently communicated to him her encounter with the angel of the Lord, because after the boy's birth, it was Abram who named him Ishmael. Abram was 86 years old by then, and it would be another 14 years before he would father the heir to the covenant, 21:5. But for the time being, he was able to enjoy this son, who he assumed was the promised heir. The angel of the Lord had told Hagar that her son was going to be a wild man, whose hand would be against every man, and every man's hand against him. 16:12. God promised that Hagar would be a matriarch. Her son would become the father of a great tribe of wild, hostile people. 25:18. Living in the Arabian desert. 25:12-18. But they would not be the promised seed. They would only complicate matters. Ishmael became the father of many nations. Arabs claim him as the ancestor of all their tribes. Whether it is legitimate or not to place the entire blame for today's Arab-Israel conflict at the feet of Abram, one lesson is clear. God's servants are to trust his word and to wait for its fulfillment, enduring patiently till the end. Questions. 1. What caused Sarai and Abram to become impatient with God? 2. Where did Sarai get the idea of getting a child by her maid? 3. How did Abram respond to her idea, and what was the result? 4. How did Hagar respond to her pregnancy? 5. How did Sarai respond to Hagar, and what did Abram do? 6. Where did Hagar go, and who found her there? Who was this being? 7. What 2 questions did this angel ask, and why? 8. What instructions did he give, and why was this difficult for Hagar? 9. What promise accompanied the instructions? 10. What was the son's name, and what was its significance? This concludes the Sunday School lesson for Sunday, June 30th, 2019. Thank you for listening. God bless.